There, does that work?
Yeah, looks like everything's good. Thanks for everybody's understanding. Next, we have Terry Stewart from the National Research Council of Canada, and he'll be continuing on this theme. So go ahead.
Excellent. I'm going to be talking about time and space representations using the same sort of framework that Chris was talking about. My overall goal, I want to build cognitive architectures where every single component is something that I can implement with neurons. That's kind of a weird goal. There's two big reasons for me for that. One is, yay, you can validate in more ways. So you can validate by comparison to neural data as well as behavioral data. But the bigger reason for me is because if I add on this extra constraint for myself that I have to say what the implementation details are, that's going to force me to consider very different algorithms than are typical in cognitive architectures. And those algorithms that I then run across, once you've identified the algorithm, maybe it's possible to use those without neurons. Maybe but it's at least going to force me to search in a very different part of the space of all the possible algorithms that are out there for understanding the brain. So that's where I'm coming at this from. And the sort of thing we've been doing in the lab, Chris just showed the some examples of the spawn model, that particular architecture. So we call that the semantic pointer architecture. And it basically fits a lot of the same structure of all the cognitive architectures. There is something like a production system. There are a bunch of modules. The production system is in control of sending commands to these modules and routing information between those modules. So that basic idea is there. And then each of those individual components, I need to go implement in neurons. And the particular technique that we're using there is called the neural engineering framework. That's the theory. The software package that implements it is called Nengo. And basically what that is as long as you have your algorithm in a particular form, we can map it into neurons. So you identify your algorithm, you say, okay, these are the sorts of neurons I want to implement this in, and then it goes and finds the connection weights for you that will do that. And the form that you're constrained to here is groups of neurons. We think of the group of neurons as representing a continuous valued vector, so x, y, so 2-dimensional vector, 5-dimensional vector, something. And then feed forward connections between groups of neurons, compute functions on those vectors. And those functions need to be relatively smooth. The less smooth they are, the more neurons you need. And recurrent connections end up implementing differential equations. So if I have a particular differential equation I want to implement, I can go and find, okay, this is the recurrent connection that will best approximate that differential equation. So as long as I can put things in that form, I can generate these low-level neural models. There's a lot more that could be said about that, but that's the general technique that we're using. So how am I going to lead to implement thinking about time and space given those sorts of constraints? So one big constraint that ended up coming in is we're trying to get into these, modeling cognitive things. Well, how do we do something like chunks? And because tons of good evidence that at least something like chunks is happening in people. And the approach that we're using there, because I have to implement everything in terms of vectors and functions on vectors, is to go and take a look at this family of things called vector symbolic architectures. And the core idea there is fine, each basic concept, each basic value that could be in a slot, each is a vector. And then you do a bunch of math on the vectors to produce a new vector that can represent, say, a chunk. So for instance, what I've got there is I want to represent a red square. And so I've got it in sort of in the form of slot value pairs. I've got a color slot, I've got a shape slot. I want the color to be red, I want the shape to be square. And if you do that math, the idea is you would get a new vector S, and that new vector S is going to represent a red square. And then in order to show that it represents a red square, you need to be able to sort of do some math on it to go and extract out, okay, what color is this? And it turns, and so the example I've got there is you take your combined representation S, you combine it with the inverse of the representation of color, and you should get out something that's kind of similar to red. There's a bunch of different implementations of vector symbolic architectures use different operations. The one we're using is due to Tony Plate, and each of those basic symbols is a high dimensional unit vector. Plus sign is vector addition. The binding operation is circular convolution. There's a vector reversal, and there's a dot product. And the reason we picked that one is all of those functions are things that are really easy for neurons to implement. And you end up with something that's very symbol-like. You can form all the basic symbolic operations, and you also get a few new capabilities. So for instance, it turns out to be really easy to represent the transformation between two different chunks. And we use that in our model of Raven's progressive matrices. So you both be able to implement something that's like normal symbolic operations, but you also get new capabilities. So that's sort of where we're starting from. I want to represent space. What do I mean by that? I want to be able to represent some sort of continuous space with no boundary. Like I don't want some artificial boundaries of, oh, I can only represent between -100, +100, you know. And I want to be able to represent objects at positions in that space. And as a starting point, we can go with something kind of like, well, how did we do list memory? So in Spawn, one of the tasks was, here's a list of numbers, please remember them and tell me, you know, what was the third item in the list, or where was the C in the list, or where was the 4 in the list. And the way we did that is by doing something like this first row here of, well, there's a chunk where A is in position 1, B is in position 2, and C is in position 3. And then the nice thing with that is you can extend it. You can have position 4, 5, 6. There's no particular limit. Yes, accuracy will drop as you add more things. But when we went and defined that, we didn't randomly choose a vector for position 1 and a vector for position 2 and a vector for position 3. We wanted there to be some relationship between those vectors because 1 should be related to 2 as 2 is to 3. And so the way we defined it is we have some vector that means position, and then we just combine that with itself to get a new vector that means position 2 and a new vector that means position 3. And so this bottom row here is a bit of an abusive notation. I'm just using an exponent to indicate do the circular convolution operation multiple times. And what I'm sort of to start representing space is like, well, hold on, is there a continuous version of that? That's really where this work started from. And I asked this question to my students, and they just immediately responded, well, of course, obviously there is. Why are you even asking this question? Because the way you implement circular convolution is you do a Fourier transform, and then you do pairwise multiplication in the Fourier domain, and then you do the inverse Fourier transform. So literally all you would have to do to implement what I just said there is do a Fourier transform, do an element-wise exponent, and then do an inverse Fourier transform. And that just is the continuous version of what we'd already been doing. So that means you can do things like what I've got written here. I've got an A in position 1.3, I've got a B in position -0.2, and I've got C in position 1.7. I can do that math, I get a new vector, and then I can ask that, then once I have that vector, I can then say, all right, take that vector, combine it with the inverse of C, and that'll give me a vector that tells me what the position is. And the way it tells me what the position is that vector that I get back should be most similar to the vector for that position and less similar to other positions. And you can see that on this graph here on the left. That's actually doing that operation. There is a peak at some point. So the similarity of that resulting vector and the vector for position 1.7 is very high. And for all the other vectors, it's lower. And there's this oscillatory ringing pattern that you see here. Importantly, there's no bounds on this. I could keep extending this x-axis to the left and to the right. So that's what I've done over here on the other side of the screen. Yes, if you extend it far enough, it will eventually loop around, but it's on the order of millions, if not billions, of units. So this is an interesting continuous way of representing continuous space. You can, of course, generalize that to 2 dimensions. You don't just have to do it in 1 dimension. So here what we've got is a representation of the situation here on the right. You've got a fox at some place you've got a dog, you've got a bear, you've got a badger, oh, there's 2 foxes. And you can build up a vector representation of that by saying, just what I've got there, a fox at position 1.3 minus 1.2, dog, and so on and so forth. That gives you a vector that represents that whole scene. And then you can ask questions on that vector using the same approach that I was showing before. You convolve it with the inverse of fox, and you get this top picture over here, which actually indicates, oh, I've now got a vector that is similar to 2 different points. This picture that I'm showing here is just the 2-dimensional version of these graphs at the bottom here on the screen. So I'm saying I have a vector that is similar to 2 different points, and that's why I want to say that that vector represents 2 different points. All right, so I can ask it, where is the fox, where is the badger? I can also ask it, well, what is at a particular location? And I'll get back a vector that is very similar to fox, but not similar to the other things. So that sort of gets this nice generalization. Cool, so that's one thing we can do with this. What else can we do with this? Well, if vectors can represent points, and if they can represent multiple points, vectors can also represent regions, right? And so you can just define the vector that represents this region, and now I can do queries like, oh, is there an object in this area? Is there an object near the center of the screen? Is there an object in the bottom right? Right? And again, I get back a vector that is, if I ask it for what's in the bottom right, I can then, it'll say, oh, okay, there's a fox, there's a badger and a bear, or at least I have a vector back that is similar to fox and similar to badger and similar to bear. It is not similar to dog or wolf. We went and tried a bunch of different things you can do with that. So you also want to be able to do some manipulations like move an object. You want to be able to, and then also sort of test what the capacity is as you add more and more objects. And this is sort of just showing that as you increase the number of stored items, eventually you hit a point where your accuracy starts dropping. But it's pretty good accuracy up until that point. And importantly, since everything that I just described there is you couldn't just do in math, you can compare both just the pure math implementation of these sorts of algorithms to then, okay, now that I have that math, I can then go ahead and use the neural engineering framework and Mango to go and implement those in neurons and show that you can get similar performance. Cool. That gives us the basic operations. If I'm going to use this in some sort of cognitive architecture, I'm going to be able to need to sequence these operations together. We can use the same production system or production-like system that we've already been using in Spawn to do that. But we also need to sort of just show that these operations, if you chain them together, they still work, that we don't end up introducing too much noise. So we ended up implementing this paper that was doing the task is things like, okay, here you're shown the picture on the left. What is to the right and down of the 8? So now you've got to do a multiple steps. You've got to say, okay, where is the 8? Okay, now I got to build up the vector that is the entire region of space to the right and down from the 8. I've got to apply that, and I've got to take a look at the result, and I've got to notice that the result is similar to 2. And so just showing that you can chain those operations and build that up seems to work fine. And so that's one thing we can do with that. Another thing that we've done with this is, all right, let's do a more complex operation. And in particular, let's do a more complex operation that lets us sort of compare this representation to other representations. So the task here is navigating a maze where I'm just going to take a neural network. I'm going to feed into the neural network what your current location is, what your goal location is, and the context signal that tells you what maze you're in. So like maybe you, no, we're not talking about how you learn the maze. This is more about once you have learned the maze, can you, given your current location, given the goal, and given what maze you're in, can you decide whether to go up, down, left, or right? So you can just treat that as a big neural network problem. And then your question is, how do you encode your current location and your goal location? And So what we ended up doing is saying, okay, let's compare the method that I just showed to a bunch of other methods. So radial basis functions, one-hot coding, tile coding, there's a bunch of different options for representing space like that. If you go ahead and train that up using normal backprop and just train a network, forget biological realism, just train a network to do that sort of task by randomly sampling, here's a bunch of mazes, please memorize these mazes. The method that I was just showing is these bottom two, beats out all of these other ones. And all of these other ones have significant problems in that they have boundaries. So the moment you say, try to, if you've optimized radial basis functions for a particular region of space, and then you try to use points outside of that space, all of a sudden that method is just going to go to be really, really bad. And then also as you scale the task up to larger and larger, the spatial semantic pointers, the things that I've been talking about, stay with much better accuracy than the other methods. And the final thing on these spatial representation is, well, there's lots of people who get really excited about spatial representation in the brain and this whole idea of grid cells. There's groups of neurons that form this weird regular firing pattern where as you move around in space, if you track one individual neuron, you can see that it fires for different points in space in like this weird hexagonal grid. And if you go and take what I just described and implement it in neurons and go and take a look at what the neural activity is, you actually don't get that. So you get what I'm showing here on the top row of this picture. This, one particular individual neuron might sort of respond to one point in space and sort of respond in its weird jittery pattern everywhere else. So that's not quite what we want. But then if you carefully choose your vectors X and Y, so instead of randomly choosing them, if you carefully choose them, so that just means that they're somewhat related to each other, they're not independent. And if you carefully choose the connection weights between the input and that hidden layer of neurons, those neurons that are supposed to be your grid cells, if you choose that, and it turns out you can analytically choose them with some ugly math, then you get beautiful looking grid cells, exactly the sorts of things that are observed in the brain. And if you then go ahead and try out of those grid cells to do the function, am I at this particular location? So if you're trying to decode out of that neural representation the function, is the current position 0.7, 0.2, then you get a big increase in accuracy. So the random choice is the blue, the error is the blue line. The black line is what happens when you use these more analytically chosen grid cells. So that seems to be consistent with a bunch of suggestions from what neuroscience is doing. So anyway, so this sort of thing maps on interestingly to grid cells in the brain. Cool. So that's space. Can I quickly cover time? All right. So I mean, still tons of things to explore with that space stuff, but ongoing research that we can talk about. Let's also try representing time. This is sort of a different problem. What I want here is I want a function that's not just a function of, y is not just a function of x. It's not just a function of my input. It's also a function of my input in the recent past. All right. So what happened recently? And how can I implement that sort of function when all I've got is feed forward connection? I've got f, y is a function of x, and I've got differential equations. Well, what am I gonna? How can I do that? Well, this is sort of the purest version of that problem. I just want a function that the output is whatever the input was. So y, I just want to be whatever x was theta seconds ago. Okay, if I hand that to a mathematician, one thing they can do is they can say, all right, well, I don't know, Laplace transforms are fun, let's try that. So you can write the Laplace transform with that function. That still doesn't help me much. But one thing you do after that is you can approximate that. You can do, so one thing that people might be familiar with is a Taylor series, where you can sort of convert any function into a sequence of polynomials. There's something sort of slightly fancier than that called the Pade approximate, which is you're turning it into a ratio of polynomials. Okay, but it's just a generalization of the Taylor series. Why might you want to do that? Well, once you've got a Laplace transform written as a ratio of polynomials, it turns out you can convert that back into a differential equation. All right, so that's this differential equation here on the left. You've got some sort of new internal state variable m. The dimensionality of m depends on how many terms you used in the Pade approximate. We're calling that q here. And basically all you have is you have these little matrices A and B, which are defined there on the right, that tell you how to update this thing over time. And if you go ahead and look at what's actually happening there when you run such a system, this internal representation m, if you want to try to decode out, okay, what was the value theta seconds ago, that turns out to be just add together all the values in m. And if you want, but you can also decode out other things. You can also decode out, well, what was the value half a second ago? What was the value or half of theta ago? Or what was the value right now? And all of those things are just different weightings of the different parameters in m. So one way to think of that is what you've done is you've taken the past history and you've compressed it, you've represented it with what turns out to be the Legendre polynomials. So you're using the Legendre polynomials as a basis space, and you're representing your past history using weighted sums of those bases. And that turns out to be nice and easily implementable as just a simple differential equation. Since it's implementable as a differential equation, now I can get neurons to go and implement that. All right, and so I just use the standard NEF tools to say, okay, give me a recurrent neural network. So this is, you can also think of this as a reservoir. You can think of it as a recurrent neural network. I'm feeding in X, it's going into this recurrent network. And then from that recurrent network, I can decode out Y, which is whatever X was in the past or some function of X over that time. We've got some examples here of doing that. So here's the stimulus as the input. This is the neural activity in the middle or in the next row. And then you do a weighted sum of the neural activity and you can get, okay, you can get an approximation of what the input was a half second ago. With different weighted sums, I can do different points in time. So this next area is showing all the different points in the past. And this all does turn out to map really nicely into something found in biology, which get referred to as time cells. You give pulses of stimulus exactly like this to a rodent, and you measure from medial prefrontal cortex. And if you take all of those neurons and if you organize them by when that peak happens, you get this nice sort of curve. Top is the rodent data, bottom is the model data, and this overlaid curve on top is actually the analytic solution of what where should those peaks end up being for a particular dimensionality of approximation. So this is the curve for Q equals 6. As a reminder, what Q is how many terms do I use when I do the approximation of this function. And it's also the dimensionality of this M state variable. All right, that's kind of weird. What can you do with that? Well, one thing we can do it, since this is sort of an optimized reservoir, an optimized recurrent network, one thing we did at it is we threw it at standard machine learning tasks. It turns out on some tasks, like the task of just output what your input was theta seconds ago, that wildly outperforms LSTMs and state-of-the-art recurrent networks. So like 6 orders of magnitude, like huge improvement on that, especially as the theta gets longer. And also on another benchmark that they use, permuted sequential MNIST. This is recognizing digits by giving you 1 pixel at a time in a fixed random order. It outperforms state-of-the-art on that task with fewer parameters. So that's cool from the machine learning side. From the more psychology and cognitive modeling side, and compared this to time estimation. It seems exactly what it'd be perfect for. There's a standard result for the scalar property for time estimation that the standard deviation of time estimates are linearly proportional to the mean of the estimated time. That falls out of the model, as does a sort of an interesting quirk that for very, very short time estimates, you actually get more of a flat standard deviation. And that is, again, exactly what you see in the model. I've also done some comparings to neural data in those situations, especially as you adjust what the time window is. So that all seems to be kind of nifty. And then the last thing we're doing in this model is doing eye blink conditioning. This is the standard. You ring a tone, and then a half second later you puff air into the eye of a rodent, and eventually the rodent learns to close its eye. There's lots of data that says this is a fairly straightforward circuit in the cerebellum, and so we're showing that you can implement that with the biological constraints of the cerebellum, and you end up learning to form that association out of these representations. Cool. That's everything I wanted to say. So this is how we're going about trying representing space. You can represent regions. You get this nice gradual decay of accuracy. You don't have any fixed boundaries in your space. Maps pretty nicely to grid cells. You can also represent time with these sorts of weird vector representations by doing this sort of differential equation. And it seems to map really nicely onto both the Legendre basis and time cells. And importantly, all the stuff that I was showing here, you can either just do the math, or you can take the math and implement it in neurons. And so I'm very hopeful that these sorts of things could be connected to other people's cognitive architectures. And that's what I got to say. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I see one question in the chat. Is this convolution-based representation similar to Matthew Kelly's holographic declarative memory and other vector-based memory schemes?
Yeah, so it's the same math operations, definitely consistent. Yes.
Okay. From Peter Yu, do you know if anyone has tried to use circular convolution as the positional encoding in transformers?
Ooh, Chris, do you want to take that one? I don't think so, but Chris might know better. He's been looking at the transformers more directly. Is he still here? He might not.
I am still here. Yep. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Cool. No. Okay. So yeah, we've been using the LMU on transformer-like problems, but we haven't used this SSP stuff on there. Yep.
Okay. From Phil Jackson, does the SSP generalize to 3 dimensions? Could you generalize it to 4 with the 4th dimension being time?
So I'll phrase that in 2 different ways. Definitely it generalizes as many dimensions as you want in terms of like they don't have to be spatial, and we then literally just keep chaining these convolutions. I don't think we've done anything past 2 dimensions, but there's no mathematical reason not to. Very recently, we have been doing things of let's combine these 2 things together. The time representation that I'm talking about here has a special property that it's like constantly updating. So like this recurrent network is just always updating the representation based on the current input. And so I think it ends up being somewhat conceptually different from the spatial representations, which at the moment we've sort of wanted to be pretty static. But it does turn out that you can feed the spatial semantic pointers into the LMUs and represent, well, what was the recent past history of my spatial representation? We're still sort of initially playing with that. But it's all just vectors, so why not?
Well, okay. All right. Well, thanks again, Chris, for that talk. I guess Andrea or Catherine, whichever is going to share the slides for the next one, go ahead.